Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Taquiena Boston. In part 2 of our conversation about A Complete Unknown with award-winning poet, literary activist, and author E. Ethelbert Miller, we talk about bringing Bob Dylan's writing into the classroom and the artist as a witness to history. A Complete Unknown is the recent biopic about musician-songwriter Bob Dylan, based on the book by Elijah Wald, Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the Sixties. Directed by James Mangold, who co-wrote the screenplay with Jay Cox, A Complete Unknown is set against the backdrop of a time of dramatic social, cultural, and political change, as a vibrant music scene is happening in New York City. 19-year-old Bob Dylan, portrayed by Timothée Chalamet, arrives in New York from Minnesota with his guitar and revolutionary talent, destined to change the course of American music.
In the historical background for A Complete Unknown, which takes place from 1961 to 1965, the U.S. and Russia are on the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. The largest demonstration for civil rights is held at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. In Birmingham, Alabama, 4 black girls are murdered in a bombing of their church by white supremacists. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The U.S. escalates its involvement in the war in Vietnam. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And 6 months before Dylan's controversial performance at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, the revolutionary Muslim minister and human rights activist Malcolm X is assassinated in New York. And that's a fraction of the historical moments during that 5-year period. Taquiena and I saw a preview for A Complete Unknown with E. Ethelbert Miller and looked forward to this conversation about Dylan, literature, and the social, political, and cultural scene driving the music in the 1960s. Ethelbert Miller has authored 2 memoirs and several poetry collections. He hosts the WPFW morning radio show On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller and hosts and produces The Scholars on UDC TV, which received the 2020 Telly Award. Ethelbert Miller is associate editor and a columnist for the American Book Review. He was given a 2020 Congressional Award from Congressman Jamie Raskin in recognition of his literary activism. In 2022, he received the Howard Zinn Lifetime Achievement Award by the Peace and Justice Studies Association and was named a 2023 Grammy nominee finalist for Best Spoken Word Poetry Album. Ethelbert's latest book is The Little Book of E, published by City Point Press. Recently, he was awarded the Furious Flower Lifetime Achievement Award, which is given every 10 years to a poet or scholar of poetry who's made a significant impact in poetry. Be advised, there are spoilers in our conversation. If you haven't seen A Complete Unknown and you don't like spoilers, best to see the movie first and then come back to this podcast. And stick around after the conversation. We've got a list of books for you to do your own deeper dive. Let's go back to Dylan, and we see just a blip in the film, but it was a significant moment. He did perform at the March of Washington in 1963. The songs that he performed were Only a Pawn in the Game, With God on Our Side, Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, which I think is taken from Keep Your Hand on the Plow.
Yeah, right.
That was the original. And When the Ship Comes In, which he performed with Joan Baez. Pete Seeger saw music as having a social role to play, and Wald says in his book, Dylan has always been a loner and rejected being the voice of a generation. What are your thoughts about artists who take political positions? I think you just stated your case right here. for yourself, and talk about that connection you see between the artist and social
Well, I
justice.
think the two best models, and they're connected. Um, one would be Paul Robeson. And Paul Robeson made the ultimate sacrifice. His passport was taken away. He was not be able to perform. Um, and he had an influence over an entire generation. I don't think we have a Harry Belafonte unless we have a Paul Robeson. I don't think we have a Danny Glover unless we have a Harry Belafonte. We have, you can see that sort of connection between the same way we're talking about Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan. I think the same way we did with Paul Robeson, and Harry Belafonte, and then Danny Glover, and then even to say James Early. I think that's a very important following. The thing about it is in terms of what is the political situation and how does a writer rise to the occasion. This is where we can bring in Baldwin, since it's his 100th birthday, anniversary of his birth, that many times the political writer is political because he or she is witness to something and testifies. Okay. And that calling is not just a political calling. That calling many times is a spiritual calling. Okay. This is why when we say about witness, about one being a witness, Baldwin comes out of the church. Okay, so that whole sense of being a witness is that what I've done in a recent talk is not just about witnessing and what you see. What I did in my talk, I brought in the disciple Thomas. I said, yeah, I don't want to hear that Jesus has been resurrected. I want to touch his wound. Okay. Now I took that and connected it to Ta-Nehisi's last book, The Message, where he talks about walking the land and he had to go to the palace. Yeah, sometimes you have to walk that land. See, those Woody Guthrie songs come out of him traveling across to America. Okay, so he's witnessed, but it's much more than just hearing or seeing something. It is a thing like I have to touch it too. Okay, but what happened if you are the witness? Then you are called to testify, and that is where the key comes in about how you're committed to your principles. Okay, I was just looking last night at the horrors that came out of the Syria, the prisons that Assad kept, crushing bodies. I didn't even see. I mean, it's amazing. And I said, okay, there had to be people there who were being tortured for their beliefs. Okay, their beliefs. At what point are they willing to say, okay, I will sacrifice not just my career, but my life? Okay, if you see what's going to happen. And I said this a couple of years ago. What happened is I felt Hong Kong was ground zero for democracy. Okay. As we move into this next 4 years of the Trump administration, it's going to be really key for another generation of activists. Are you willing to be arrested about Gaza, which interrupts your education? Are you willing to, and you're going to get feedback from your parents, because if they got you school, how important is this particular cause? Okay. Now for the artist, he or she will begin to say, okay, I wrote this poem, I sung this song, and I stand behind this. Okay. Everybody's not going to do that. And I think it's very important because, there will be people who are doing spoken word who will have some piece that might go viral. The same way we saw, because people had cameras, George Floyd's death becomes viral. And also it's a question in terms of how the technology helps us to be activists. All of a sudden, you have your cell phone and you capture something. And now when you look at their image, you're politicized. Okay. You're not hearing about the sit-ins down south. You're actually seeing something. You're actually seeing the sit-ins, and so that's that in real time. So that's going to be completely different. But it also says, okay, what is an individual artist, and does the artist have a special role? Okay, in terms of responding to the needs of the community. I always go back to Sterling Brown's poem "Ma Rainey," because in that poem, which is a testament to the great blues singer, you see how with the flood of the Mississippi River, how Ma Rainey appears and she puts the whole community on her back. and how, and people follow her outside the tent, and they look about where they used to live, and her songs is what you would say, these blues songs is going to give them, this community, the resilience to rebuild. Okay, that's not in the lyrics after, but you realize, okay, after she sings this song, after she takes that hurt, absorb that collective hurt, and that collective memory, she's able to say, okay, now that I've taken that out of you, now, that grief and everything, you now are willing to now rebuild. Okay, I've heard the sorrow songs. Okay, but I'm taking it as a vessel, changing it around to make it joyous, so you can celebrate. Okay, this gets into the role of where, as an institution, the church becomes that place. Okay, or if you're August Wilson, you take that and you put it on the stage in this theater.
Yeah. Ethelbert, you said you used Bob Dylan's Memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, in your memoir writing workshops, and you've written 2 memoirs yourself. Fathering Words, The Making of an African-American Writer, which was selected for a City Read here in D.C., and The Fifth Inning, about the second half of life after age 50. Why do you include Dylan's memoir on your reading list for the memoir writing workshop?
Well, when I'm teaching memoir, and keep in mind, when we're looking at a memoir, we're talking about a slice of their life. So I'm always looking at how memoirs begin and how memoirs end. Also, when I'm teaching a memoir class, I've assigned readings of other memoirs, and I always encourage the people participating in my class or workshop to select, and sometimes I will instruct somebody in a nice gesture to read a certain book to get people outside their comfort level. Okay, so you might be a suburban person. I want you to read about an inner city woman who's a lesbian, or somebody who's coming out back from the war or whatever. I want you to read something that's completely different. I want to read somebody from Ireland who survived whatever, so that you get a sense that as you write the memoir, it's not just about your life. Okay, sometimes it's getting back to what you're witness to. I like how Dylan's memoir, and I select Dylan because the only other sometimes celebrities don't write their own memoir. It's just co-written, it's ghostwritten. The person I was also using was Carole King. I liked her book, and there's no other name on it but Carole King. I was using Dylan because Dylan talks about where I think he's meeting the boxer Jack Dempsey, and so it begins where he's not necessarily talking about himself. It's a conversation, with someone else. That's very important because many times people who write memoirs are writing it with, I. Like if for Fathering Words begins with me talking about my brother Richard walking down the street. It's a completely different. So that's a very interesting prompt in the workshop. You're also dealing with bringing in a memoir that somebody knows. Okay.
True. Yeah.
But and keep in mind, many times when these books come out, they're not read. And so when I'm teaching, and this is I feel being a good teacher, I want to bring books in that maybe people heard about but never picked up. Okay. And that's what I feel a good teacher does. When I was teaching my classes, no matter what I was teaching, I always began my class with what was going on in terms of current events. Okay.
So you give that context.
I
Yes,
context,
we exist
right?
in a context.
Right. I don't, and sometimes you can say, okay, how do you feel about this? And I learn a lot. That's just like Woody Guthrie, okay, and Bob Dylan. I was teaching a class, online class with my students down in Victoria, Texas, and I was using a prompt. I said, okay, where were you on 9/11? Okay, a couple of my students said, like, oh, Professor Miller, that's New York. It was basically like, then I said, oh, this is Texas, right? And it was just a thing where you can't assume, when you give out these prompts, okay, you can't assume that everybody knows who Bob Dylan is. And because Bob Dylan is important to me, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to bring this in to the book, and that's what I try to do, and that's why I selected that memoir along with others. Just like the last one I read, I won't even say that. Last memoir, we'll just beep that out. Anyway.
Yeah. His memoir is interesting too because it's the last section where you learn about his introduction to Woody Guthrie and how he got into folk music. So even in terms of how he arranges time in the memoir, it doesn't start from point A to point B. It's
Right.
more like we started at M, we then went to Z, and now we're at
Well,
A.
right. You
Yeah.
see, when you say that, between you know, I don't like the memoirs that begin with somebody just the family history, like we came here at 1619. I can't read that. Okay, you know, usually what happens, I fast forward to when you met your wife or husband. I just can't get through this sort of thing, like, But at the same time, if I hear or read somebody, and they're getting into the architecture and things of that sort that I don't know, then I feel, okay, now just like witness, this person is writing about not just themselves, but the history of this small town. And that's important.
Yeah.
For some reason, when you talked about that writing prompt, where were you at 9/11, and you're in Texas, that's kind of interesting you got the answer you got, because for some reason, I was in Washington, D.C., and one of the primary memories I have is of the news footage of George W. Bush, who was not in Washington, D.C., but in a classroom with children reading a children's book.
I
Right.
think in Florida.
Yeah.
hmm
And it makes me wonder if we've lost our ability to have a collective consciousness
Well,
or
I don't think we
collective
lost that. I
experience.
mean, I was in 9/11. I was in Altoona, Pennsylvania, which is where the third plane went down. And what was happening there is I was with Dinty Moore, writer, and he writes about this in one of his books, because we were debating whether we should continue the program that I was invited to do, and so we decided to go ahead with it. And because it was a writing class, I said, okay, if we say that this is like Pearl Harbor, and I remember saying, I said, if this is like Pearl Harbor, then we're going to be rounding up Arabs like they're Japanese. See, I said, just if that's it, then that was just how you use language to help. This gets back to the role of the writer and the artist. I was there to do a program. This is what's happening. How do I take these events, just like I'm sharing news stories in my class? I'm scheduled to do a program, but this has happened before our program started. How do I connect what I'm saying to this program? Using myself as a writer, and I'm saying, let's look at the language. Okay. To give you an example, I always remember this. I never forget this one. I was invited to a little high school here in DC, and the theme was say no to drugs and yes to a career. And they had a fireman, police officer. They had all this, right? And I was the last person. And they had a little bit, and they said, and I said, see, well, I'm here as a writer, and I just deal with language. And I said, see, what is the today's program? It says, say no to drugs, yes to a career. But we know this. It is a career and the pressures that gives rise to us using drugs. I got snatched out of there. I never got my box lunch. Everybody had no box lunch. I didn't get the box lunch with the apple and the cookie. They just escorted me out the door. It was not what they wanted. But the kids was like, "You're right about that, Mr. Miller." I feel stressed out right now. But I was just doing what I was responsible to. I was coming in as a writer, so I was dealing with the theme, and that's what it said. Anyway.
Well, in preparation for this podcast, and I'm glad that we talked a lot
Speaking of
about
writers and writing.
writers and writing. In preparation for this podcast, and I'm glad we talked a lot about books and writers and authors, and Dylan as a literary figure as well as a musician. We still had to do a substantial amount of reading in preparation for this conversation, or for this conversation.
And listening.
We had to do a lot of reading and listening. So for our podcast audience who may be considering adding A Complete Unknown to their movie list, what would you recommend to get a fuller experience and appreciation of this story?
Well, I begin with a book that, I gave my daughter. It was very important. And I think that it should be required reading. That's Howard Zinn, people's history of the United States. You get a whole sense. I mean, we're talking about Woody Guthrie and Dylan. One thing I realized when I came here, I had no knowledge of like labor history. I had no labor songs. I just didn't know what that is. So I think that's a very important book. Also, it's like John Hope Franklin from Slaves to Freedom. These are the big books that give you an overview. I think what you want to talk about, if you're going to understand Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie, you have to say, okay, how do I understand America? Okay. I always, one of my good friends is Doug Brinkley, and Doug Brinkley's always doing a big book on the Mississippi River. He does a big book on Carter, or he wrote the biographies of Rosa Parks. I think Doug Brinkley and he used to give the magic tour where he would take kids in the high school on a bus with their teachers and stuff and go visit the key civil rights movements places and stuff. That's how I got to Memphis. But I say that because there's certain historians that we should be reading who have done the work, the same way I made earlier in this discussion, Alexis Gums, doing the biography of Audre Lorde. Keep in mind that that's the second biography of Audre Lorde. The first was done by Alexis DeVoe. That these are books that I think are very important. There's biographies of Baldwin, that should be read, not just his own work, and I feel that there's a lot of work we need to do in the classroom to prepare our people for, okay, how do I better understand um, Dylan? And this is why I always felt that there should be these courses on whether there was a course on Lady Gaga, a course on Dylan, which would be 15 credits. I remember at Howard, I was developing a course around Du Bois and Robeson. You would just study Du Bois for one semester. You can study Dylan for one semester. Okay, you could take Desolation Row, Memphis Blues, and you could be studying that. You're studying Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot. It's just that much that's in there. Okay, and what are we saying? Maybe it would just be interesting to see after Dylan won the Nobel Prize, was his work incorporated into the classroom in terms of literature? How many departments across the country decide, okay, this man received such and such? Okay.
Good question.
Good point.
Or for example, I don't know. I know that when they give out the prizes, maybe you can check on this. Usually that speech is found available. It's packaged. Like for example, if I'm Amanda Gorman or I'm Elizabeth Alexander, and I read a poem at the inauguration, that poem is packaged by that company as a special, like a gift. And I think that when I think of Nobel Prize speeches, the ones, and I was looking at it, the memorable one for me, one is Pablo Neruda, and the other is Faulkner. Okay, but what happens is that many times the speeches are never highlighted unless somebody says something that's controversial, whatever. But what happens is that we don't teach that the same way. For example, I feel that if I'm developing a textbook, I want to have the eulogy that Ossie Davis gives of Malcolm X, because when you teach the eulogy as a text, okay, almost everything of how we see Malcolm X comes out of Ossie Davis's eulogy. So now, if you talk about the role of the artist, Ossie Davis is an artist, and what he does as an artist, he uses his self, his interpretation, and giving the eulogy of Malcolm X's life. So the Black Shining Prince, Malcolm is our manhood, all comes out of Ossie Davis's eulogy. Okay, no posters until you have that. But then this is the key. Nowhere in that eulogy is there any reference to what makes Malcolm X Malcolm X. There's no reference to Islam. Okay, there's no reference to the fact that Malcolm X had two funerals. He had a burial, and he's buried. He's not Malcolm X. He's buried El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. So, but we never see that. We never see. How can you eulogize somebody And what makes them, this is why when I went to prison a couple years ago, and I told all the little guys, "Oh, you guys are Malcolm Littles. You just breaking into people's apartments. That's why you're in jail now." And they were laughing. And I said, "See, and you want to be Malcolm, but you guys are not going to be celibate when you get out of here for 2 years." They said, "You're right about that, Brother Miller." But I was saying that what happened, this is the role of the artist. In this case, and I take this in my own, you mentioned fun word. Ossie Davis elevates Malcolm to that mythical level. It is at my father's funeral when my father, who asked to be cremated, and that was a thing, the black family, like, we ain't going to the cemetery?
Yeah.
Yeah. But my father asked to be cremated, and I'm in Yonkers, New York, and they lowered my father in a little box. I stood on that thing, and by the thing I said, I can't accept that my father is this little box being burned in her. I'm going to do what I'm gifted to do. I feel every time somebody makes reference to my father lives. Okay? My father lives. I did something that I feel I'm very pleased. I did what an artist is supposed to do. I gave witness that my father lived. Okay? As I also tell people when somebody asks me, I said, I never worked as hard a day as my father. Okay? And the ultimate respect, and you see this sometime in these August Wilson plays. What happened, I had a reading in New York, in the old Chinatown. My father was not feeling well. He came out to see me, and he climbed up these old steps and, get to the room in Chinatown. He sat next to my friend Linda, and my friend Linda said at the end, "Ethelbert, your father doesn't know what you do." But he said, "My son didn't preach a good sermon. Didn't he today?" But what happened, I'd give him my bag. I said, "Dad, here's my bag. I'm going to go out with my friends." Just one of those little clubs with Woody Allen and Dylan be hanging out at. I'm in Greenwich Village. And I said that I get back to the house. I asked my father, "Where's my bag?" My father said, "I put it somewhere." I said, "But Dad, they had my money in it." And my father said, "They paid you?" And I looked at my father, and this is where the son you respect. I could not tell my father, and I knew he was dying at that time too. You look in somebody's face in the eye, and I could not tell my father, this man who brought me into existence, who gave me everything. I could not tell my father how much I made reading a few minutes of poetry, which would have been something that he would have worked for maybe 2 weeks. There was no way. Out of respect, I said, I can't do that. But I was also aware, that who I was and my father was responsible for who I was. And what I'm telling you is what I tell my son and daughter every single day, to get through whatever they're trying to get through, because as Larry Neal said, it ain't easy. But it's not supposed to be easy, you see. And when you get back to Dylan, the key thing of an artist willing to change, where there's always an invested industry. The record companies, they don't want you to change. They want you to play the same music, sing the same song.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is why the other artists, just like somebody like Dylan, Miles Davis. Okay. If you want to hear Kind of Blue, that's nice. Okay.
Go by the record.
Go by the record. And then I remember when he was getting this conversation with I think he was doing something like Time After Time, something like that, and Marcel's
Cyndi Lauper's.
Right. And people's going to be like, "Oh, wow, you do it." And he's like saying, "Well, these jazz tunes, what do you think they were? What, pop songs?" You know what I'm saying?
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
my favorite things, isn't that what I'm saying? I mean,
Yeah.
and what happens is that, if you look at it, the beauty of an artist, and gets back to we've been saying this in this program, is other people doing the work, other people having their own interpretation of it. But if they're going to have their interpretation, you're willing to do your own and keep moving forward. Okay, I mean, that's what you do. I mean, it's like it's different from being Marco Polo. Okay, this is it. There's nothing beyond the Indies. And this is why Sun Ra, the other artist, a good example. Sun Ra, I remember he said, Sun Ra left, right? Sun Ra left, and then he said, then Sun Ra came back just to tell people that he left. That's a profound statement. He left. The same way I ended my talk down in Miami with a quote from another artist, which is sort of like Dylan. It's Charlie Parker. And Charlie Parker said, I can hear the new music. I just can't play it yet. What we see in, A Complete Unknown, Dylan is being, see, it's always very interesting how they capture the writing process, he's in there playing the pretend, and he's like writing when he's with drum by his writing, because sometimes that can be corny, like for me, okay, they're doing this, so, okay, I write usually when I'm coming out of the shower. Okay, is there going to be a nude scene with Ethelbert? You know what I'm saying? With water dripping off my back and my muse curled up on the couch. You know what I'm saying? But that's how I write. You see?
Yeah.
But what happened is I was looking at how they writing that process, and then you want to make sure. And this you look at it when people look at this film. Dylan has that sort of little hunchback look. He has that little thing, and if you look at how sometimes young geniuses are portrayed, there's a certain sense of they're so cerebral that their head is bringing them down.
He has kind of a bird-like.
Exactly.
Posture.
And posture, which I mean, Dylan works like that. And I think that's very interesting. The other thing, which I think is very important, is how certain sounds are created in the beginning of certain songs, like Cooper with the guitar, how he wanted to come in and they was keeping him out, and then he sneaks into the studio, or how he gets the whistle, and that becomes the beginning of the song. Because if it's not done well, it winds up being corny. You see, it's just like you're a playwright, like you are, Michon, and I'm watching the first scene, and first the character comes in, and they put a gun in the drawer, and they go back out. We know that somebody's going to get shot by the third act.
Right, yeah.
Oh, why is a gun in there? You know what I'm saying? But what happens, I was looking at, okay, how do you convey a person the writing process without someone seeing like they're suicidal or whatever, or angst or whatever.
Or drunk.
Or drunk. Right, exactly. And I think that that's one of the things that you have to have that balance. And I think probably because Dylan's still living, you can probably get away with certain things. Now, one would say that the same, quote, recklessness that we see him as he's trying to change his music style is how he's riding the motorcycle. So he's taking risks.
Yeah.
You see, he's taking risks. And that's the thing where I think of a number of writers, even people who have been injured by motorcycle accidents. And that's the thing that like, for example, the famous John Gardner was killed in a motorcycle accident. That's who immediately I thought of when I think of Dylan. But what happens is that, that same how he's driving and stuff like that, and sometimes people get caught up in speed, their mind is going fast. They want to go fast. Or somebody would say symbolically, they're trying to get to the future. Okay. They're hearing, that's why the Charlie Parker, I can hear the music, I just can't play it yet. There's something in my head, I just can't get it. I'm looking at what's probably as controversial as what's happening in the movie is later on where it seems as if Dylan becomes like born again. We get this sort of religious, that's another phase that we're getting. So you have to look at that. But I think it's a real thing in terms of looking at the film and saying, how much does this film help a young person who doesn't know about Dylan but gets pulled in to it? And then it leads to a discussion in terms of the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, all these other things of that time. Realize that this is a soundtrack of that period. For me, for example, I was not influenced by Woody Guthrie, but I definitely was influenced by Arlo Guthrie and Alice's Restaurant.
Yeah.
You
can buy anything
right,
you want
right,
at Alice's Restaurant.
Right. And that, and I got so much into Arlo Guthrie before I was talking to you guys today. I went back and I found Arlo Guthrie singing Amazing Grace. And in there, he goes into this talking, like they're talking. And I think it's a story that his father tells him. He's passing it on. And it's about, I think it's his father. It's about he tells this story about these two rabbits hanging out, these two rabbits, and they see these dogs, right? And the dogs see them and they start dogs are chasing the rabbits, right? And the dogs are catching the rabbits, catching up on the rabbits, and then to the rabbits dash into the like a log, right? And the dogs are outside barking, and the mom of the rabbit says to the male rabbit, "Well, we'll just stay in here until we outnumber them." And it's really funny because he's saying all this around the song Amazing Grace. But he just goes on this tangent, and you get caught up in these unbelievable stories. And when I think about that, I'll come full circle. It reminds me what pulled me into poetry in the first place was Sterling Brown in between his poem telling these lies, which were better.
Yeah.
The lies were better than the poems,
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. You hear Arlo Guthrie doing this thing, and you realize that he's kept that in tradition, of that storytelling, and it's spoken word. And Nikki Giovanni just died, and I saw the same thing where Nikki Giovanni's just talking, and I'm sitting next to Lucille Clifton. Lucille Clifton looks at me like where is this going? And Lucille, being an ordinary woman, being Lucille Clifton, is just being like that. She's giving me the eye, like, what is it? And all of a sudden, she went from like Mars and all this other stuff right into ego tripping. And when she got into ego tripping, the crowd, the audience went crazy, man. Because it's like you say, "Wow, this is what it means to have that relationship to the audience." Now, getting back to the film, this is what Pete Seeger is like saying, "Bob, don't mess this up. 60, we got this going. We got a nice thing. People come for the folk music. Please, Bob, don't mess this up. Don't mess this up." Because what happened? Yeah, the artists can be way ahead of their audience.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Way ahead of their audience.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you realize what Pete Seeger's trying to do. To some extent, yeah, the community, it's bigger than you, Bob.
Yeah.
Okay? It's bigger than you. And so how you balance that is very difficult. But you can't tell Bob Dylan, you can't do this.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. And tradition and innovation are both parts of
Exactly.
creation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we've learned in this conversation is Bob Dylan is a prompt where you can unpack a lot of things.
Well, I'm unpacked.
Yeah. So, Ethelbert, thank you for joining us on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. And we look forward to having you on the show again, because there's a lot to unpack about film and literature, especially with so many films being using books.
Well, I would say this. I would say this, and I thank you this because it always, important to remember where you came from and things of that sort. And I feel that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Bob Dylan. I would say that. I might not have been here. I could put Langston Hughes aside and Barack, but I would say definitely Dylan, and then the other person who tragically, took his life is Phil Oakes. And because of doing this podcast, I went back and I realized that the song "Changes" was one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. And I posted it on my Facebook page because preparing for this took me back. And I said, I was singing all these Dylan songs, Paxson, Simon and Garfunkel, and with Paul Simon, I remember so clearly. I saw Martin Luther King only once in my life. It was a protest in front of down by the UN, and it must have been like 66, 67. And when I turned around and saw all these people, I actually really bumped into Paul Simon, and that's all I remember. Forget about King and the mountaintop. I bumped into Paul Simon, and for me, I went and saw. My wife took me to see Dylan back in 2012. And I just want to see him. I realized that my life, who I am, the songs that I would go around like just the lines they're singing, that's what shaped me. That was what I remember. And I don't want to lose that, and I don't want to recreate myself. Like how you guys are, with the film industry, and someone says, "Well, yes, and I remember when I was starting out, and I read all of Joyce." Yeah, right. You're not from Ireland. But and what happened? People reinvent themselves, and I remember it was a Toni Morrison. I asked Eugene Redmond. I said, Redmond, did Toni Morrison ever mention that she was influenced by Henry Dumas? I mean,
Yes.
she was his editor and stuff,
Beautiful writer.
and he said, well, she did before she won the Nobel Prize. Because what happened after you reach a certain stature, sometimes you don't make reference to things, you see. And this, as a literary activist, I end on this note. I'm always looking at writers, okay, how they deal with success, not failure, how they deal with success. And if there's one writer who I really admire with how they have dealt with success, would probably be Ta-Nehisi Coates. I felt that it has not gone ahead. There's things that he know. If you look at some of the programs, he still is like, let me listen. I'm listening to you. Like, I don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
And I say this in terms of one coming full circle about writers and their role. I say that because one of the things lacking that people don't look at closely is that in Between the World and Me, and even in the message, Ta-Nehisi does not believe in God. Okay.
Right.
And that's what makes
Yeah.
him different from Baldwin. And so what happened? He's not going to tell you about the future because he can't see it. He's not a prophet. He's a very good journalist who's given us a long form, and he's very important for what he's doing. And it's almost no different than when Baraka was like around the Gary Convention. He was organizing, holding the community together. That he realized, with all these Negroes, I can't keep these people together. I'll go back and write some poems. And so he realized his contribution was going to be as a cultural worker, not as a political leader.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, his son is mayor of Newark. So you realize that, and he knew that was happening before he checked out of here. And I think that's where you have to realize, what is your role as an artist? Okay. And I think for Dylan's role was very important for the civil rights movement, maybe for the Vietnam War, but hey, you keep going.
Searchlight Pictures, A Complete Unknown, is currently in theaters. Do a search to find out where the film is playing near you and when the film will be streaming. You can purchase the books mentioned in this conversation from our affiliate bookstore, including Elijah Wald's Dylan Goes Electric, Newport, Seeger, Dylan and the Night That Split the Sixties, Bob Dylan's Memoir Chronicles Volume 1, and his collection, The Lyrics, and Ethelbert Miller's memoir, Fathering Words, as well as the Little Book of E poems. Your book purchases support independent bookstores in your community, and a small commission supports the Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters podcast. Go to our website at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters or the podcast description for the link to the affiliate bookstore. Sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related resources and activities. You can find the link on the webpage as well.
Listen to part 1 of our conversation with E. Ethelbert Miller about A Complete Unknown, episode 64, available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Leave a review. Michon and I hope you'll give the podcast 5 stars. Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michon Boston.
And this is Taquiena Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Taquiena Boston. Thank you for listening.